The evening was still, the kind that makes you notice the ticking of the clock more than usual. I sat in my little living room, lamplight soft against the old wallpaper, thumbing through the messages on my phone. At 67, I didn't expect many beyond reminders from the pharmacy or a church bulletin. So when Maribel's name appeared, my heart warmed. My daughter seldom sent me anything other than quick notes. A voice memo felt different, almost special. I pressed play, expecting to hear her gentle voice saying she loved me or asking if I needed anything from the store. Instead, her tone cut sharp, laced with derision I had never imagined directed at me. She clings too much, always needing attention. It's embarrassing, Maribel said, laughing lightly, the sound hollow in my ears. My hand trembled. I thought surely I had misunderstood, that perhaps she was speaking about someone else. But then came the unmistakable lilt of another woman, Corinna. Her mother-in-law joining in the mockery. That woman is too old to be useful anymore. A burden. Really, their laughter mingled, a harmony of cruelty that froze me in place. I replayed it once, then again, and again. The words didn't soften with repetition. They hardened, calcified, each syllable carving away at the picture of love I had carried for decades. My daughter, the child I worked double shifts for, the girl I sewed dresses by candlelight to make sure she stood tall among her peers, had not only dismissed me, she had handed me over as a punchline. The room seemed smaller, pressing in on me as I sat in the quiet aftermath. I stared at the phone glowing in my hand, waiting for it to offer some kind of explanation. But it only held the truth I couldn't unhear. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It was not rage, nor tears, though both hovered close. It was an ache that pulled deep, heavier than silence. I rose slowly, set the phone on the table, and knew the night ahead would not bring rest, but a reckoning I could no longer avoid. Morning light filtered through the curtains, painting thin stripes across the floor. I dressed without thinking, my body moving through habit, while my mind circled back to the words I could not unhear. The air outside was cool, scented faintly with salt from the river, and I let my feet carry me along the familiar streets lined with live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Each step was meant to steady me. Yet the echo of that recording clung to me, heavy and sour. By the time I reached the church steps, I felt hollow. Reverend Lucas stood at the door, shaking hands as he always did. His eyes paused on me, concern flickering in his expression. "You all right, Sister Rowan?" he asked quietly. I forced a smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals, and nodded, just tired. He didn't press, but his gaze lingered as I slipped into a pew near the back. Grateful for the dim quiet, the hymns rose and fell, but I could hardly mouth the words. All I heard was Maribel's laughter, Corinna's agreement, my own daughter making me small. I pressed the hymnal shut and stared at my hands, ashamed of how easily I'd let their voices take root in me. Later that afternoon, a knock pulled me from my haze. Addie stood at the door, balancing a still warm blueberry pie. She talked brightly, fussing about her garden, about how life was too short to worry over anyone's approval. "Dignity isn't what they give you, Annalise," she said with a knowing look. "It's what you choose for yourself." I thanked her, but after she left, the quiet swelled again. I set the pie on the counter untouched. Sitting at my kitchen table, I placed the phone in front of me. My hand hovered, trembling, as though the device itself carried poison. Part of me longed to call Maribel, to demand an explanation, to plead for her love to outweigh those cruel words. Another part feared that opening my mouth would sever the last thin thread binding us together, and so I sat in silence, the question pressing harder with each heartbeat. Sleep eluded me, so I sat at the table long after the sky had darkened, the phone still in front of me. My reflection stared back in the black glass, and with it came memories I hadn't invited. I was 28 again, fresh widow with a daughter barely 5 years old, and a stack of bills I had no hope of paying. I remembered sitting at my sewing machine in the dim light, piecing together gowns for the wealthy women in town, my fingers raw from endless seams. When that work wasn't enough, I scrubbed offices at night, breathing in the sting of bleach until my head throbbed. On the worst weeks, I skipped meals, quietly sliding the extra piece of chicken onto Maribel's plate, telling her I wasn't hungry. Her little eyes would widen, but she'd eat, and I told myself it was worth it. Years later, when Maribel married Dorian, I thought perhaps she would finally be secure. But not long after, whispers of his debt reached me, risky investments, a loan hanging over their heads. Without a word to anyone, I emptied nearly all of what I'd saved, paying it off to spare her shame. Neither of them mentioned it again, as if my sacrifice had dissolved into thin air. At the time, I told myself it was love. Now, the silence felt like betrayal layered upon betrayal. I rose and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down an old photo album. The plastic sleeves crackled as I turned the pages. There was Maribel at 8 years old, clutching the doll I had stitched together from fabric scraps, smiling as if the world had given her treasure. I traced the photo with my fingertip, feeling the sting of devotion that had never been returned. The room seemed to lean with the weight of those memories. I closed the album carefully and set it back, the ache pressing deeper. The sacrifices I had buried to keep her life steady now rose like ghosts, demanding to be seen. And with them came the sharp certainty that the past would not stay buried forever. Sunday arrived with its usual sense of ritual, though I no longer felt the comfort it once offered. Maribel had invited me to lunch at their house, a polite gesture I had accepted out of habit more than hope. As I entered the Hart estate, the polished floors and pristine furnishings seemed to hum with a quiet superiority, a constant reminder that I had never quite belonged here. Maribel greeted me with a perfunctory hug, her eyes already scanning the room for the attention of her mother-in-law, Corinna. Plates clinked. Conversation flowed, and I found myself slowly sinking into the familiar role I had played for decades, the quiet observer, the unacknowledged guest. She praised Corinna's cooking with ease, lifting a spoonful of casserole as if to savor her approval, and in the same breath, she barely glanced at the dish I had brought. I forced a smile, feeling the sting as the words from the voice memo replayed in my mind. Patterns I had long ignored now settled over me with clarity. Birthdays, where my presence was optional. Holidays monopolized by the Hart family. Afternoons spent tending to my grandchildren, while Maribel and Dorian went off to parties and events, each one treating my care as a convenience rather than an act of love. My dignity, so carefully cultivated over a lifetime of resilience, cracked in small, jagged lines. Unable to bear the quiet humiliation any longer, I excused myself and stepped out onto the manicured lawn. The grass was so green it almost hurt, the fountains sparkling under the southern sun, all arranged for appearances rather than warmth. I walked slowly, letting the cool breeze brush against my face, and realized something that had been true for years. I had been invited to serve, to fill a role, but never to belong. Every chair I had been offered at their table had been a gesture of convenience, never of inclusion. And as I stood there, the sharp sunlight catching the edges of the fountain, I knew that the time for quiet endurance was ending, and the moment for reckoning was quietly approaching. I returned home in silence, the hum of Savannah's evening settling around me. The air inside my house felt familiar, unjudging, almost protective. I moved toward the cedar chest that had sat in the corner of my bedroom for decades, its surface polished by years of hands carefully opening and closing it, the scent of cedar, faint but comforting. I lifted the lid and carefully sifted through the contents. Old letters, faded photographs, and finally, papers I had kept tucked away for emergencies, deeds to my modest home, bank statements chronicling decades of quiet savings. Despite the relentless demands of life, despite every sacrifice I had made for others, I had managed to preserve a part of myself, a hidden strength no one had recognized. And then I found it, a single, folded letter. The envelope yellowed with age. Inside was proof of the loan repayment I had made for Dorian shortly after he and Maribel married. I had never mentioned it. No one had thanked me. No one had acknowledged the burden I had quietly carried to protect their comfort. Holding the letter in my hand, I felt a rush of clarity. For so long, I had measured my worth by the affection I received, by the smiles or nods I could coax from my daughter, by the quiet approval of a family that had always overlooked me. But now, with these papers before me, I saw that I had power they had never imagined. I had leverage, evidence, and dignity preserved in ink and parchment, waiting for the moment I chose to use it. I whispered the words aloud. More to myself than anyone else, if they see me as a burden, they've forgotten who carried them. The weight that had pressed on my chest for so many years shifted slightly, replaced by a steady resolve. The house was quiet, but I could feel the stirrings of a plan taking shape. Subtle but insistent, a recognition that the next steps I took would no longer be dictated by others' perceptions. I would not speak yet, but the balance had begun to tilt. Quietly, irreversibly, I had spent the afternoon preparing my small kitchen for company. A quiet determination settling over every detail. The table was modest, but set with care. Each plate and glass in its place. When Maribel, Dorian, and Corinna arrived, their stiffness was immediate, the kind that fills a room with unease before words are spoken. We shared a polite meal, the conversation light, almost forced. I listened to Maribel's practiced laughter, Dorian's occasional nods of approval, and Corinna's cool commentary on the local garden club. Each word, each gesture felt rehearsed, as if they were unaware of the weight I carried. The truth I had decided to reveal. When the last bite of dessert had been taken, I placed my phone carefully in the center of the table. Their eyes flicked to it, curiosity mingling with unease. I pressed play. The voices filled the room, Maribel mocking me, calling me clingy and embarrassing. Corinna's laugh followed, sharp and unrepentant, confirming every cruel word. Time slowed. Silence pressed down like a heavy curtain. Maribel's face drained of color, her fork trembling in her hand. Corinna sipped her wine, calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The words spoke for themselves. Cutting through years of polite pretenses, I looked each of them in the eye and said, quietly but firmly, "This is what you thought of me. Now we all know." For the first time in decades, I felt the balance shift. Subtle, but undeniable. The truth was no longer mine to bear alone. It was a shared weight, one they could not ignore or dismiss. I set my hands in my lap, letting the silence settle, knowing that this revelation was only the beginning of the changes to come. I let the silence linger for a few heartbeats, watching their reactions settle across the room. Maribel's lips trembled, Dorian's jaw tightened, and Corinna's eyes darted between us, searching for some sign of weakness I had none to offer. I drew in a steady breath and began, calm and deliberate. "I have given everything I could for this family," I said, my voice even, without accusation. I have cared for my grandchildren, sacrificed years of my life to support your choices, and preserved your comfort at the cost of my own. That ends here. Maribel's hand shook as she reached for her napkin. But I didn't pause. I will no longer provide unpaid childcare. That responsibility is yours to shoulder. Their faces shifted subtly, shock, guilt. A flicker of disbelief, but I continued. And I will no longer offer financial help. Every dollar I once gave to maintain stability for this household, every quiet sacrifice that went unnoticed, will remain mine. I reached into my bag and set a neatly folded letter on the table. This, I said, lifting it so they could see, is proof of the debt I once covered for Dorian. Do not mistake silence for weakness. I will not be questioned, nor will I be dismissed. Corinna's poised exterior faltered for the first time. I saw the calculation in her eyes, the recognition that I was not the fragile woman she had presumed. Dorian stared, stunned. The careful composure he always carried disrupted. Maribel finally broke, tears spilling freely as she buried her face in her hands. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not soften the moment with apologies or explanations. I simply folded my hands on my lap, letting the weight of my words settle. Respect is not negotiable, I said, voice steady, almost serene. Without it, my door remains closed. I leaned back slightly, the calm in my chest spreading outward. For decades, I had allowed my love to overshadow my own dignity. Now, the scales had shifted, and the measure of my worth was finally mine to assert. And in that quiet, deliberate power, I felt the first stirrings of freedom. The days that followed the dinner felt different in Savannah. Word traveled quietly, carried in whispers across oak-lined streets and into church pews. And slowly, the world began to take notice. Neighbors who had once nodded politely as if my presence was expected, not desired, began to offer warm greetings with genuine respect. Church friends lingered longer in conversation, subtly acknowledging the courage it must have taken to confront my daughter and her family. Even some of Corinna's acquaintances, women who had once admired her social grace above all else, began to speak with a hint of surprise about the steadiness I had shown. Corinna, who had always moved through life with a certain unassailable poise, seemed smaller somehow. Her carefully maintained exterior faltered when she realized that the truth of my dignity was circulating faster than any gossip she could control. And yet, in private, she approached me, eyes steady but wary. "I misjudged you, Annalise," she admitted, her voice low, almost reluctant. "You've shown a fortitude I never expected. I admire it." I listened without comment, letting her words settle. There was no satisfaction in hearing her acknowledgement. What mattered was that her influence could no longer overshadow mine. Irony twisted itself into the moment Corinna, once so eager to belittle me, now navigated the treacherous terrain of her own reputation, unsure of how to maintain control. Maribel's world shifted alongside hers. Friends and colleagues began to question what they had assumed about my daughter, and she found herself trapped between loyalty to her mother-in-law, the whispers of peers, and the undeniable truth of her mother's strength. The social balance she had relied upon so comfortably began to waver. I felt none of the triumph one might expect from revenge. Justice had arrived quietly, not through confrontation or punishment, but simply through exposure. My worth had been revealed to those who had overlooked it, and in that revelation, a subtle, enduring power took root. The first flicker of relief stirred in me, a recognition that the world I navigated had shifted, and I was no longer merely reacting to it. The mornings felt different now. I woke with a sense of lightness I hadn't known in decades, a quiet anticipation that wasn't tied to anyone's approval or attention. I joined a quilting circle at the community center, the women chatting and laughing around their work tables. Threads and fabrics strewn about like confetti. Their warmth was steady, unpretentious, and I felt a connection that had nothing to do with obligation or expectation. Addie and I began volunteering at the library twice a week, cataloging donations, helping children find books, and sharing stories. I discovered that I could spend hours immersed in words and quiet laughter, filling the same rooms that once seemed so lonely with purpose and company of my choosing. One afternoon, I pulled down a travel guide to Charleston I had bought years ago and tucked away, too busy raising others to consider myself. The thought of walking along the cobblestone streets, watching the pastel houses reflected in the harbor water, made a small thrill rise in my chest. I set a date in my calendar, not consulting anyone, not seeking permission. Back at home, my little house had transformed along with me. Fresh flowers replaced the dusty vases. The curtains were washed and sunlit, and the corners no longer echoed with quiet resignation. It felt like a sanctuary again, a place where my time, my attention, and my joy mattered. I no longer measured my days by the approval of my daughter or her family, nor did I wait for an invitation that might never come. I was no longer waiting to be included, no longer bending myself into shapes to fit their expectations. I was living, entirely and unapologetically, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of old hurts lighten in the steady warmth of my own choices. The sun hovered low over Savannah, casting long shadows beneath the live oaks and letting the Spanish moss sway gently in the breeze. I sat on my porch, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, letting the quiet settle over me. The world seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different. I could hear the faint hum of life in the neighborhood, the distant laughter of children, the soft wheels of bicycles over the cobblestone streets, but none of it reached me the way it used to. I was no longer listening for signs of approval, no longer straining for gestures of acknowledgement. I thought of Maribel, of the daughter I would always love, and of the ways she had misunderstood me. But the love I carried for her no longer felt tied to obligation. To sacrifice that went unnoticed, or to the need for validation from anyone but myself. I realized, quietly, that love without respect is hollow, a shell without warmth or meaning, and respect without love, though rarer, feels empty, a promise that carries no comfort. I whispered the truth aloud, more for my own ears than anyone else's. I once thought love alone was enough, but love without respect is cruelty. Respect without love is emptiness. I choose both, or I choose myself. The words lingered, a mantra of all I had learned over decades of struggle, patience, and endurance. I rose and walked to the cedar chest, the one that had held so many fragments of my past. From it, I retrieved the flash drive that contained the voice memo, the source of so much pain, yet also the catalyst for this reclamation of self. I placed it carefully inside the chest, locked it, and set the key in its place. It was no longer a weapon, no longer a wound to reopen. It was a reminder of survival, of clarity, of rebirth. I sank back onto the porch, the sky bleeding into soft oranges and pinks. I let the breeze carry away the remnants of doubt, the small ache of old betrayal. In that quiet, I felt the fullness of a life reclaimed, a dignity restored, and the simple, unshakable truth that my worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition. And for the first time in decades, I felt entirely, unequivocally free.